All right, let's dive in today. We're going deep, really deep, into a question that, let's be honest, keeps philosophers up at night. How do we understand power? Not just in a vague sense, but rigorously when there's a whole bunch of actors involved.
A whole tangled web of agency and influence, right? Well, luckily for us, there's a whole field that's tackled exactly that. We're talking about mathematical logic. And for this deep dive, we're turning to a fantastic resource, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on reasoning about power in games.
Yeah, I mean, this entry is dense, it's pretty technical in some places, but it's packed with insights on how logic can help us dissect strategic interactions. And at its core, that's what a lot of philosophy boils down to, right?
Yeah.
Agency, preference, the structure of social systems.
Exactly. And that's what we're after today. We want to pull out the key logical frameworks and concepts and see how they can give us a sharper, more precise way to think about those core philosophical issues.
It's like giving ourselves a new mental toolbox for analyzing these familiar philosophical problems.
Absolutely. And to use those tools effectively, we need to start with the basics. What do we even mean by a game in this context?
Right, because we're not talking about Monopoly here.
Not exactly. A game here is a much broader idea. Think of it as a mathematical description of a situation where individuals or groups are interacting, making choices, and those choices lead to different outcomes. And the important thing is that these choices are often made independently, all at the same time.
Okay, so it's a framework for understanding interactions, not just a board game.
Exactly.
And they use the Treaty of Rome as an example in the entry, right?
Yeah, it's a classic example. Think about it. You have all these different countries involved, each with their own agendas. And the final outcome, whether the treaty is adopted and what it looks like, that all hinges on the independent choices of these players.
And those choices are further constrained by things like voting rules. It's like a real-world example that perfectly illustrates these logical concepts we're going to be talking about.
It is. So let's get into it. Where should we start?
Well, the entry lays out kind of the fundamental ingredients of these logical games. Where do they begin?
With the players themselves. You got to have players. Usually we're talking about a finite set of players, the individuals or groups making the decisions.
Okay, players make sense. What else?
Well, then you have the possible outcomes of those interactions. And this is where it starts to get interesting. Because an outcome can be a really simple thing, like a yes or no on a vote. Or it can be something way more complex, like a detailed description of how resources are distributed or, the specific articles of a treaty.
Right, so the level of detail you include in your description of outcomes is crucial. It shapes the whole analysis.
Totally. It determines what features of the game you can even talk about. And for us, thinking about these things from a philosophical perspective, we need to be really careful about how we define these outcomes. It all depends on what aspects of power and agency we're trying to understand.
Okay, so far we've got the actors, the players, and we've got the potential results, the outcomes. What's the next piece of the puzzle?
The third ingredient is the preference relation. We need a way to formally capture how each player values those different outcomes, what they see as desirable or not, what they want.
Right, because just knowing what the options are isn't enough. We need to know what each player is actually aiming for.
Exactly. And the way we do that is with a notation like W, let's say. W. That means player considers outcome to be at least as good as outcome. Think of it as like a ranking of outcomes from their point of view.
Okay, so it's about formally representing their priorities. And, from that basic idea, we can then define when a player strictly prefers one outcome over another, which is written as W suki W, or when they're indifferent between two outcomes, written as W simi W. These distinctions seem crucial if we're talking about rational decision-making.
They are. They're fundamental. Think back to that border protection example we mentioned. A country might strictly prefer, let's say, a moderate level of spending on border security over either a super high level or a really low one. And, within that moderate range, they might have a more fine-grained ranking of different spending levels. The entry also mentions this idea of a disagreement outcome, usually denoted as
the worst case scenario.
Right, the outcome nobody wants. And it's often assumed that any agreement, anything that avoids that disagreement outcome is going to be strictly preferred by everyone. It's like the baseline for comparison.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, here's where it gets really interesting for me. From a philosophical standpoint, how do we actually bring logic into the picture here? How do we connect these ideas about subjective preferences to the formal machinery of logic?
Right, good question. That's where modal logic comes in. Now, modal logic is a whole fascinating field in itself. But for our purposes, think of it as a system that lets us talk about possibilities and necessities. In this context, we use these special operators to talk about preferences. So, for example, you might see something like Diamond-Prix.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Sure. That expression basically means there is some outcome, let's call it W, that player considers at least as good as the current outcome, and in that outcome, the proposition is true. So we're taking these messy, subjective preferences and translating them into the precise language of logic.
Ah, so we're formalizing those preferences, which allows for a much more rigorous analysis. That's the power of logic, right? It gives us this framework to analyze the structure of something like a preference relation to see the logical implications.
Exactly. And, the entry also talks about these key properties of preference relations, things like reflexivity, transitivity, connectedness. These might sound technical, but they're really fundamental assumptions we often make about rational preferences.
Assumptions that maybe we haven't examined as closely as we should. So what do those mean in this context?
Well, reflexivity, which we write as W pre-chi W, is the most basic one. It just means that any outcome is at least as good as itself. It's a kind of a sanity check.
Right. If you prefer something else to itself, there's probably something wrong with your preferences.
Right. Transitivity, written as if W1 pre-chi W2 and W1 pre-chi W3, ensures that preferences have a kind of consistency. If you prefer apples to oranges and oranges to bananas, you should also prefer apples to bananas.
Okay, that makes sense. What about connectedness?
Connectedness means that for any two outcomes, a player can always say whether they prefer one to the other or if they're indifferent between them.
So you have to have a complete ranking of all the possibilities, at least in principle.
Yes, you have to be able to compare any two outcomes.
Yeah.
And the entry points out that standard modal logic can capture reflexivity and transitivity pretty easily, but it struggles a bit with connectedness.
Why is that?
Well, basic modal logic is really good at looking at local relationships between outcomes, like if this outcome happens, then it's possible for this other outcome to happen. But connectedness is a global property. It requires you to compare every single pair of outcomes. To handle that, we need something more powerful. The universal modality, sometimes called the global modality.
What does that look like?
It's written with a capital A. So a varphy means that varphy is true in absolutely every possible outcome, no exceptions. It's like saying it is necessarily the case that. Combining that with our preference modalities lets us express things like trichotomy, which basically says for any two outcomes, a player either prefers one, prefers the other, or is indifferent. That, along with transitivity and reflexivity, implies connectedness.
So even something as fundamental as assuming a player can rank their options requires bringing in this heavier logical machinery. It's fascinating how even simple assumptions can lead us to these more complex logical systems.
It really is. And the entry goes on to discuss how logic can handle strict preference and indifference.
Right, because we've been talking about weak preference so far, at least as good as.
Exactly. Strict preference, written as, satisfies this property called irreflexivity. Basically, no outcome can be strictly better than itself.
That makes sense.
And it turns out standard modal logic can only define irreflexivity if our language is rich enough to uniquely identify each outcome. We need to be able to say this specific outcome and no other to make irreflexivity work.
Interesting. And what about indifference?
Indifference, represented by semi, is an equivalence relation. It has reflexivity, transitivity, and symmetry. Symmetry means that if W1 is indifferent to W2, then W2 is indifferent to W1. It's a two-way street.
Makes sense.
Proposition 4 in the entry shows how we can capture this symmetry with modal logic. And these three properties together, reflexivity, transitivity, and symmetry, tell us that indifference partitions the set of all outcomes into these neat equivalence classes, or sets of equally preferred outcomes.
So you're grouping together all the outcomes that the player sees as equally good.
Precisely. And the structure of indifference with those three properties is actually the basis of a well-known modal logic system called S5. So even something as seemingly simple as indifference has a rich logical structure.
It's amazing how these intuitive ideas about preference, things we use every day, have this elegant logical underpinning. It really shows how logic can help clarify and make more rigorous these core philosophical concepts of choice and value.
I agree. And, the entry also touches on utility functions.
Oh, right. That's a classic way to represent preferences in economics, isn't it?
It is. A utility function, written as WEAW write our math PR, is basically a function that assigns a numerical value, a real number, to each outcome. It's like a score for how desirable that outcome is for the player.
So a higher number means a more preferred outcome.
Exactly. And definition 5 in the entry tells us that a preference relation can be represented by a utility function if and only if for any two outcomes, and WAWW is true precisely when in WWWO. So the numerical values of the utility function reflect the order of the preferences.
So it's about connecting those qualitative preferences, like I prefer this to that, with a quantitative representation.
Right, and it turns out that any weak linear order, any ranking of a finite set of outcomes without ties, can actually be represented by some utility function. This connection between qualitative and quantitative is useful for certain types of analysis, particularly when we're dealing with uncertainty or probabilistic outcomes.
Okay, so logic helps us formalize what the players want, their preferences. But a game is more than just desires, right? It's also about what players can actually do, how their choices influence the outcome. How does logic deal with that aspect of power?
That's where effectivity functions enter the stage. An effectivity function, denoted by E, is a way to formally capture what coalitions of players can achieve. Basically, it takes a set of players, a coalition, and tells you which sets of outcomes they can guarantee.
So it's about the power of collective action, what groups can make happen by coordinating their choices.
Exactly. So if a set of outcomes, call it X, it means that coalition has a strategy, a way of choosing their actions. That will ensure that the final outcome of the game is going to be somewhere within that set, no matter what the other players do.
So it's about what a group can force to happen, regardless of what the others do.
Right. It's a powerful concept. And the Treaty of Rome is a perfect example here. A single country might not be able to dictate the terms of the treaty. But a large enough coalition of countries, if they work together, they might be able to ensure that certain provisions get included or that certain outcomes are impossible. Their combined voting power, represented by the effectivity function, gives them that ability.
Right, so the effectivity function tells us about the limits of power for different coalitions.
Precisely. And the entry mentions this idea of superset closure or outcome monotonicity. It basically means that if a coalition can guarantee a set of outcomes, they can also guarantee any larger set that includes those outcomes. It's pretty intuitive.
Yeah, if you can guarantee outcome A, you can also guarantee outcome A or outcome B.
Yeah.
More options.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this mathematical concept of an effectivity function. How do we bring logic back into this picture?
Well, there's a system called coalition logic. It's a modal logic that's specifically designed to reason about the abilities of groups.
Okay, so it's like the logic of teamwork.
You could say that. Coalition logic introduces these special modalities, for example, C var phi, which basically means coalition C has the power to guarantee that proposition will be true. More formally, we say that true var phi is true at a particular state or outcome if and only if the set of outcomes where var phi holds is one of the sets that coalition C can achieve at that state.
So let's just talk about what coalitions can and can't bring about. Again, for a philosopher, this is really interesting because we're talking about the relationship between individual actions, the power of groups, and the resulting social states. It's all connected.
It is. It's all interconnected. And the entry then dives into all these different mathematical properties of effectivity functions. Things like liveness, safety, regularity, end maximality, superadditivity, coalition monotonicity, well-foundedness.
Whoa, okay, hold on. That's a lot of jargon. What do these actually tell us?
Well, they describe different ways that power can be structured within a game. For example, liveness means that a coalition can't force nothing to happen. They always have some power to influence the outcome. Safety means a coalition can always guarantee something, at least the set of all possible outcomes. Regularity says that if a coalition can guarantee something, then the players outside of that coalition can't guarantee the opposite.
So these properties give us a kind of vocabulary for talking about the different flavors of power.
Exactly. Superadditivity captures the idea that if two disjoint coalitions can achieve certain outcomes independently, then together they can achieve at least the intersection of those outcomes. Coalition monotonicity, meanwhile, says that if a coalition can achieve something, any larger coalition containing those same players can also achieve it.
So adding more players to a coalition can never hurt in terms of what they can achieve.
Right, at least not according to coalition monotonicity. And the entry shows that coalition logic can actually express many of these properties.
So we can formally reason about these different types of power structures.
We can, but there are limitations. The entry points out that basic coalition logic can't distinguish between what are called playable and truly playable effectivity functions. This has to do with a subtle distinction about whether the grand coalition, the coalition of all the players together, can achieve every single individual outcome or just sets of outcomes.
It's like asking, can they fine-tune the outcome perfectly, or do they have broader control?
Exactly. It's a technical point, but it highlights that even our most powerful logical systems have limits. There are some distinctions they can't make.
Okay, so we've built up this logical foundation by looking at preferences, what players want, and effectivity functions, what coalitions can actually do. Now, let's get to the heart of the matter. How logic helps us analyze power itself. The entry makes a distinction between cooperative and non-cooperative games. Let's start with the cooperative side of things.
All right, so in cooperative games, we're focusing on what groups of players can achieve by working together, by coordinating their strategies. A key idea here is the concept of a solution concept. It's a way to try to predict or describe the outcomes that are most likely or most stable in a given game.
Right, because in a complex game with multiple players, there could be tons of possible outcomes. A solution concept is a way to narrow it down to say, these are the outcomes we should expect.
Exactly. And for cooperative games, one of the most important solution concepts is the core.
The core. What does that mean exactly?
The core is basically the set of stable outcomes. An outcome is stable if there's no coalition of players that could both achieve a different outcome and have all of their members strictly prefer that new outcome to the current one.
So it's the set of outcomes where no group has both the incentive and the ability to deviate and do something else.
Precisely. The core is all about stability. It's like saying, if we reach an outcome in the core, nobody has a good reason to rock the boat. And this concept, it has huge philosophical implications for things like social contracts, political agreements, any situation where we're trying to understand how cooperation can be sustained.
It's like a formal way of talking about what makes a social agreement legitimate, or at least stable in the face of self-interest.
Exactly. And the entry gives a nice example using, again, the Treaty of Rome. They imagine the scenario where there's some economic policy being proposed, let's say a budget of 5 million euros for some program. The question is that 5 million outcome in the core?
How would you figure that out?
Well, we need to look at whether there's any coalition of countries that could agree on a different budget, let's say 8 million, and all those countries prefer that 8 million outcome to the 5 million, and crucially, whether they have enough voting power together to actually implement that 8 million budget. If such a coalition exists, then the 5 million outcome is not stable. It's not in the core.
So it's about finding those points of equilibrium where no group can both want and be able to upset the balance.
Right. And the example suggests that, depending on the specific preferences of the countries and the voting rules, there might be only one outcome in the core, meaning there's only one truly stable agreement.
Okay, so that's the core. How does logic actually help us talk about this?
Well, Proposition 9 in the entry gives us this neat formula that basically tells us when an outcome is not in the core. It goes like this. Big way to substitute n to have.
Mm-hmm.
That might look intimidating, but it's actually saying something pretty straightforward.
Break it down for us.
Okay, so the formula says that if the current outcome is 8, then there must exist some coalition that can achieve a different outcome where every single member of C strictly prefers that new outcome. So if this formula is true at a particular outcome, it means that outcome is not stable. There's some group that can and wants to deviate.
So it's a logical way to express that instability.
Yeah, right. If the formula is false at an outcome, it means that outcome is in the core. And if you want to know whether the core is empty, meaning there are no stable outcomes, Proposition 10 in the entry tells us that we just need to check if that formula is valid, meaning it holds for all possible outcomes and all possible preference assignments.
So it's a test for whether there's any possibility of stability at all.
Precisely. And the entry also mentions that we could use even more expressive logics, like hybrid logic or logics with special atoms for coalitional power, to represent the core in different ways. There's a whole toolbox of formal systems that can capture these ideas about stability and cooperation.
Okay, so that's the cooperative side of things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how does logic approach non-cooperative games where the focus is on individual strategies and choices?
Right. So in non-cooperative games, we're shifting our attention away from coalitions and focusing on the individuals. We want to understand how each player will act based on their own preferences and what they anticipate the other players will do. It's all about individual rationality and strategic thinking.
Right. So it's like, what's the best move for me given what I think everyone else is going to do?
Exactly. And a non-cooperative game starts with something called a strategic game form. It lays out all the basic elements. the players, the set of possible strategies for each player, the set of outcomes, and a function that maps every possible combination of strategies to an outcome. Then we add the player's preferences over those outcomes, and we have a non-cooperative game.
Okay, so it's like we're creating a blueprint for how individual choices lead to results. And example 7 in the entry uses the Treaty of Rome again, but this time, each country's individual vote is treated as a strategy.
Exactly. The outcome, whether the treaty passes or fails, is determined by the combination of those individual votes. And to connect us back to the idea of coalitional power, the entry introduces the alpha effectivity function.
What does that tell us? It sounds like a more individualistic take on effectivity.
In a way, yes. Definition 12 in the entry explains it this way. The alpha effectivity function for a coalition in a non-cooperative game includes all the sets of outcomes that can guarantee by choosing a joint strategy, no matter what the other players, those not, do.
So it's still about what a coalition can achieve, but it takes into account the strategic interplay with the other players. It's about what they can force, even if others are trying to stop them.
Exactly. And Theorem 13 shows this really interesting connection. It says that an effectivity function is truly playable, meaning it satisfies those subtle conditions we talked about earlier, if and only if it can be represented as the alpha effectivity function of some non-cooperative game. So there's this deep link between these two ways of thinking about power, the cooperative and the non-cooperative.
It's like they're two sides of the same coin.
Right. And Proposition 14 further reinforces this link by showing that certain axioms in coalition logic hold if and only if the effectivity function is an alpha effectivity function. It's like these different perspectives are all converging on a deeper understanding of how power works.
Okay, so that's the link to cooperative games.
Yeah.
But for non-cooperative games, when we're talking about stability, the big idea is Nash equilibrium, right?
Yes, Nash equilibrium is the central solution concept here. It's the idea that no single player has an incentive to change their strategy, given what all the other players are doing. It's a point of strategic balance.
Right. Everyone is playing their best response to everyone else's best response.
Precisely. And more formally, a set of strategies, one for each player, is a Nash equilibrium if, for every single player, their chosen strategy gives them the best possible outcome, assuming all the other players stick to their strategies. It's like everyone is locked into their optimal choice, given what everyone else is doing.
Well, example 8 illustrates this with a voting scenario, right?
Yeah. Yes. The example shows how an initial situation where there's no agreement, no consensus, could shift to a stable agreement if one player decides to change their vote. Suddenly, a Nash equilibrium emerges where nobody else wants to deviate because it would make their outcome worse. It's a simple example, but it really highlights the logic of Nash equilibrium. And the example also points out that even a state of disagreement can be a Nash equilibrium if no individual voter can unilaterally improve their outcome by changing their vote. It's a kind of a stalemate situation.
So you can have stability even in the absence of agreement, which is an interesting thought.
It is. It's counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you think about the individual incentives. Now, the entry does point out that standard coalition logic, the system we talked about earlier, is usually not powerful enough to fully express the conditions for a Nash equilibrium. It just doesn't have the tools to reason about individual strategy profiles and the consequences of one player changing their move.
So it can't capture that fine-grained strategic thinking.
Right. But researchers have explored extensions to coalition logic, like Nash-consistent coalition logic, that try to capture aspects of Nash equilibrium. The entry also notes that fundamentally, Nash equilibrium can't be defined in basic modal logic alone. We need logical systems that can talk about both preferences and the available choices for each player simultaneously. It highlights the complexity of this idea.
Right. We need logic that can handle both what do I want and what can I do, which is really the essence of strategic thinking.
Exactly. And then the entry just briefly touches on this whole range of further logical explorations of power. They talk about things like injective games, non-monotonic action logics, quantified coalition logic. It's a huge field with tons of active research.
Okay, can you just give us a little taste of what those are about?
Sure. Injective games are games where different combinations of strategies always lead to different outcomes. There's no redundancy in the outcome function, and the entry connects this to a system called propositional dynamic logic with intersection, which can reason about sequences of actions and their combined effects. Non-monotonic action logics explore situations where gaining more abilities might actually decrease your power, which is a really counterintuitive idea. Quantified coalition logic, on the other hand, lets us talk about all coalitions or some coalitions, which is really useful for analyzing things like veto power, where a single player can block a decision. It's fascinating stuff.
It sounds like it. It's clear that logic offers this incredibly powerful and diverse toolkit for analyzing power in all its different forms, going way beyond those intuitive notions we often rely on.
Absolutely. These logical frameworks give philosophers a way to precisely define and analyze core concepts like agency, preference, the ability to influence outcomes, both individually and collectively. It lets us unpack the structure of power itself.
And as the entry concludes, there's no one right logic for analyzing power. The choice of which system to use depends entirely on what specific aspects of power and strategic interaction you want to focus on.
It's like choosing the right tool for the job. Different logics illuminate different facets of the concept of power.
Well, this has been an incredible journey through the logic of power, but before we go, here's a final thought for our listeners to ponder. Given this whole range of logical tools we've explored, what do you think would be gained? And maybe more importantly, what might be lost if we try to create a single, unified logic of power? What would it take to capture all these different aspects of power in one system? And would such a system even be desirable? What philosophical assumptions will we be making about the nature of agency, interaction, and influence if we tried to reduce power to a single, formal system? It's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.